This is the I Will Teach You a Language podcast, episode 161.
Welcome to the I Will Teach You a Language podcast. Weekly motivation and language learning tips to help you become fluent in any language. Now, here's your host, Ollie Richards.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the I Will Teach You a Language podcast. Very happy to have you here. If you're new to the podcast, then welcome, especially. This is where we get into and talk about all things language related. Everything from the materials you need to the motivational hacks and tricks you need to actually keep going for long enough to learn the language, because it does take time. But I know you guys are smart because you're here and you're listening to this. So welcome. We've got a great question today and I want to dive straight in. But before we do that, you know the drill. Let's thank the sponsors of the show, italki. And if you are looking for language lessons of top quality from a native speaker teacher, then you can do much worse than going to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/free lesson and picking up $10 worth of free credit with them. Now, we've got a good question today. It comes from Chris, and here it is.
Hi, Ollie. My name's Chris. I live in Minnesota, which, for your listeners who don't know, is in the northern central part of the United States. My question is about speaking formally or informally. I've been learning Turkish for about 3 years now, and I've actually been to Turkey 4 times. One of the main things that I have problems with when I'm speaking to people is knowing whether or not to speak formally or informally. And there's a clear distinction between the two in Turkish. You talk to somebody informally with the pronoun sen, and formally with the pronoun siz. It's kind of like tú and usted in Spanish. So I don't know how you handle it in Spanish. Do you mix the two in a conversation? And like if you meet somebody new in a bar, like a really informal setting, do you have to speak formally even if there's somebody that's new to you? I just really like to hear your feedback on that. Thanks. Keep up the great work.
Hey, Chris, thank you for a wonderful question. I know I always say that, but it's usually true. Of course, you guys only ever submit good questions, but nevertheless, I like this because it deals with the kind of gritty nuts and bolts of actually speaking. Okay, not what you learn in the book, but what do you do, as you say, when you're in a bar and you want to talk to someone. Now, it goes without saying here that every language has its own conventions. It's not the same in Spanish as it is in Turkish, as it is in French, as it is in Japanese, for example. Every language has got different conventions as to when and where you should speak formally or informally. Now, what's interesting is that I've always, in different languages, I've always found myself resisting speaking formally. I think it's because I come from an English-speaking background where we speak to everybody on the same level. You know, whether you're talking to your little brother or, you're meeting the Queen, you still use you, right? So I think native English speakers have this. It's kind of hardwired into us to want to use the casual forms of address in other languages, and so I think that's probably the source of my resistance. It's very interesting to actually think about what that is, but I have ran into problems or difficulties with that. So, for example, in Spanish, you generally use tú, unless you're meeting someone who's significantly older than you or in a position of authority or you want to pay them particular respect. You generally use tú. But in Japan, you would never even think about using the informal form of address unless you're talking to a child or someone much younger. At least when you first meet them. So, in Spanish, it's never been a problem because I just tend to use tú all the time. But in Japan, you have to get used to using a formal or polite way of speaking as a matter of course. And so, even now when I speak Japanese, I feel kind of funny. So you can be in a social situation, speaking very informally with someone, but you'll still use, in the case of Japanese, you use masu and desu. And that kind of just feels funny to me. It gets easier after a while. But I think identifying that my default is to speak informally has been quite useful because that allows you to kind of just be conscious and to start to, appreciate that you might have some kind of resistance to it, and then adjust the way you speak to the new language. That might just be me. I'm sure in your case, Chris, you probably you don't have this same weird hang up that I do. But nevertheless, the key, I think, is to really understand in the language you're learning, in your case Turkish, the key is to understand the cultural significance of formal and informal speech in that language, because that makes your decision much easier. So, for example, in the case of Japanese, you've got, it's difficult, So the informal way of saying, for example, if you want to ask someone, shall we eat? Then you've actually got lots of different options. So you could say, taberu, tabemasu ka, meshi-agarimasen ka, taberaremasen ka, omeshi-agari narimasen ka. These are all different possibilities. And so as a student of the language, you don't want to be in a position where you're basing your decision of what form to use on rules that you've been given in a textbook. That's rubbish. That you can't make those kind of decisions in reality on the ground when you have to start speaking quickly. What's really important is to understand what form of the verb you'll use is culturally relevant or culturally appropriate. So for example, once you know that the base form of the verb, taberu, is only used for close friends, family members, and children maybe, then that quickly eliminates that in most cases. Once you know that omeshi-agari narimasen ka is ultra, you'd only say that to the boss of the company that you're working for, or something like that. It makes it much easier to make those decisions. So it's very important that you talk to native speakers, ask them to explain, when do you use this, when do you use that, because that is the kind of the basic understanding that you've got to get. So for example, earlier I said that in Spanish I tend to always use tú, but then if you're in Colombia, for example, then you have to use usted with friends or family. As it's a culture, it's kind of as I understand it at least, it's kind of a mark of affection, respect. So you speak to people who are close to you in the most formal way. In French, for example, I think it's probably fair to say vous is more common in French than it would be to say usted in Spanish. And then so in French, you can you can ask a question. So you could ask something that, you can say, je peux vous tutoyer? Can I start speaking to you casually? And that's something that you would ask someone, for real, because you're kind of navigating this minefield of, which one should I use? So the key, if you understand culturally, socially, what should be used and when, then that is the most important thing to figure out. So, I guess, Chris, that, you said you've been to Turkey 4 times, I think, and the specific situation you're talking about is in a bar. Now, I don't know Turkish, I've got no idea. But I think generally what I'd say, my gut reaction, Chris, is that I imagine that you're probably not speaking Turkish a great deal, actually in the country with people, because you would generally get a feel for that pretty quickly, I think. If you pay attention to what people actually say, if you go to bars a lot in Turkey, for example, and you listen to what people say, then usually these things become clear the more that you actually speak the language. So, for example, in Spain, you would almost certainly use tú when you're chatting to someone in a bar, but in Japanese, you'd almost certainly use the more formal way. So I don't know about Turkish, but as a general rule of thumb, I just use the polite form. Why not? It's always better to be polite than not. And then, based on their reactions, you can adjust what you say accordingly. The other thing you can do, watch TV and movies and pay attention to things like that. Do people start speaking, introduce each other formally or informally? Look out for those things, and that will help you figure out what's appropriate. The thing is that as I'm speaking, I'm kind of thinking to myself, does it really matter all that much? Is it that important? Because as a foreigner, you generally get a free pass in these situations, which is not to say it doesn't matter. I wouldn't want people to think it doesn't matter if you speak formally or informally, because it does. But the point is that if you're out there and you're paying attention, then, people are not going to get offended if you speak to someone politely instead of informally, or vice versa. As long as you're paying attention, then you should very quickly figure out what it is. But again, my kind of default response is, well, speak formally to people and then take it from there, see how it goes. So I hope that's helpful, Chris. Very, very useful, very, very useful topic, and a very, very interesting question. If you would like to ask me a question, please do. You can go to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/ask to do that. I'd also really appreciate a review on iTunes if you've enjoyed the podcast. I'd love it if you opened up iTunes on your phone or your computer, searched for I Will Teach You a Language, and simply leave a quick review. It would mean a lot to me. And at the end of every episode, I like to leave you with a resource of some kind on the topic of the show. And today I'm going to give you a quote. I've been trying to do a few more quotes recently because I think they're quite cool. And this one is from Otto von Bismarck. Why not? And he said, "Be polite. Write diplomatically. Even in a declaration of war, one observes the rules of politeness." And I think that's a good quote to live by, at least until you know that it's better to speak casually. Thanks very much for listening, Chris. I hope that was useful, or at the very least entertaining, and I'll see you back in the next episode of the podcast. Take care.